Welcome to Talking Books, a series from Talking Feds that brings you in-depth discussions with authors of the most important and interesting contemporary works of fiction and nonfiction. It's axiomatic in the United States, as de Tocqueville observed 200 years ago. Nearly every political or social dispute becomes a legal dispute. And a corollary is that lawyers have been at the center of the degeneration of our politics in the last 30 or so years, including the hyperpolarization and sheer nastiness of the Trump era. Today's author is, to my mind, not only the most visible and important of the political lawyers of his generation, but also the most thoughtful. Bob Bauer has been a lawyer at the highest levels to government officials, including White House counsel to President Obama from 2009 to 2011, but also to campaigns, political parties, and political figures in their private capacities. The potential overlap in those roles is part of what his new book, The Unraveling: Reflections on Politics Without Ethics and Democracy in Crisis, is about. The Unraveling is an account of political lawyering that's part memoir, part analysis of the problems, and part prescription for trying to get us out of the deep muck. The book has the retrospective vantage point of an avid participant in the down and dirty of political lawyering who has taken a step back to analyze how the excesses and cut corners happen and how the entire system can take at least modest steps back to an ethics anchored in the devotion to values of democracy across party lines. Bob Bauer, welcome to Talking Books.
Thank you, Harry. Good to be here.
I wanted to start with the tone of the book, which to my mind is self-critical and even a little penitent. You see yourself in your important roles as having contributed, at least modestly. Your contribution is much less than those of, say, some of Trump lawyers in the last few years, but at least modestly to the politics without ethics and democracy in crisis. Or that's how I read it. Is that right? And was it a large part of what motivated you to write the book?
I thought if we were going to have these conversations, then we should start from a vantage point as far away from partisan finger pointing as possible and display some humility. And I write in the book a good bit about the strain on political ethics of winning at all costs, what it means to have sort of runaway partisanship. And so I had to think, again, consistent with the attorney-client privilege and what it is that I could say without breaching client confidence, is I had to openly address questions I had about legal interventions in the political process that I'd been publicly associated with and evaluate them with the distance of time and ask myself whether maybe some of what I have to say, some of my criticisms could be fairly directed at me. And I thought that was an important way of opening up the dialogue. It also, by the way, was a very sincere self-reflection. I do have second thoughts about these issues, so I didn't have to fabricate that line of argument for the book.
We'll get a little bit more into this, but that point, the warrior mentality, you describe in a way that made all the sense in the world to me, but I hadn't really reflected on before, which is the real zero sum of nearly all political campaigns. That is, the loser pretty much is consigned to political oblivion. I was just thinking today there's this close Senate race in Texas. And, it seemed 6 years ago that Beto O'Rourke might, in fact, bring down Senator Ted Cruz. He didn't, and he's not really in the landscape anymore, and maybe Colin Allred is in the same place. But in a similar way, we think of broad relations between the parties in a healthy era, which we are not in now, as having a kind of understanding, we'll lose some, we'll win some, we'll have another day. And maybe that's just not true now for the Republican Party. I'd actually like to talk about that. But this point that, it's really winner take all and loser go home, maybe for good, seems to absolutely infest, all political campaigning and lawyering.
Particularly at a time when losing is unthinkable because the stakes seem so tremendously high.
Yeah, right.
If you, in a somewhat more, a quieter political era, a less polarized one could imagine, a loss is a loss, and then there's a rematch at some point, maybe by the losing candidate, maybe by somebody else. But when everything is at stake, when the stakes really do seem so high. Everyone is speaking about the election as being fundamentally existential and potential effect on people's lives. Then a loss is unthinkable for a variety of reasons. The candidate doesn't want to lose and, as you say, be consigned to oblivion. And also the effects of losing are so dire. And so for that reason, the pressure to do everything possible to win, I mean, short of the most flagrantly illegal, like targeting your opponent for assassination, is all within bounds, because the best political actors, the most effective political actors, are the ones who will do what it takes to win.
Yeah, let me stick with that for a second, even though it's not part of the unraveling. But in some ways, the most troubling and important and puzzling aspect of the last few years is not Trump himself. You can posit that Trump's sort of a rise here and there and maybe gain power and maybe don't, but the absolute dereliction or obeisance of the Republican Party. And Stephen Levitsky, I don't know if you know him at Harvard, has a really interesting thesis that the reason is that the Republicans now see themselves, they're hanging on by their fingernails to try to cobble together electoral college majorities when they are playing a losing game in the popular vote that's only getting worse. And that's the reason that you have such kind of shameful, I don't mean this in a partisan way, but you have a whole party, lining up behind things they know to be false and a person they know to be disreputable. Does that thesis make sense to you? Is that, you think, the best account of why we're in such bad straits with the Republican parties not stepping up at all?
So speaking of the Republican Party in particular, I think the concern about what it means to be so chronically losing the popular vote in a presidential election certainly accounts for, as you say, some part of how they're hanging on for dear life. But also, and I think we should take some of that rhetoric seriously, they think if they lose their grip and they fall and they begin to lose elections at the national level, that somehow their version of America will lose out forever. That there's something that will then occur, transforming the culture and the policies of the country, that is just absolutely alien to them. And again, I don't know what Donald Trump actually thinks about anything. I mean, that's a different story. But I remember particularly, and the article, a well-known article that was written in 2015, 2016, that I think was called the Flight 93 election, that everything was at stake, that if that election wasn't won, the country would be visited with terrible woes and calamities. And so that also accounts for, that's the additional engine behind a sort of whatever it takes to win mentality, whatever lie you tell, whatever tactic you employ, whatever attack on the electoral process you launch, all of that is justified in the name of saving this version of America that's important to you. Now, again, there are, understandably, in response to Trump, those on the Democratic side, on the left, who feel comparably that everything's at stake in the current election, absolutely everything.
Fair enough. Let me ask you to elaborate on that a bit, because in the book, you review many decades of political fractures, highlighting unethical incidents dating back, 20, 30 years. The 1988 Willie Horton ad by Lee Atwater, who famously, apologized on his deathbed, the Ken Starr investigation, the Al Gore campaign's manipulation of Bradley's voting record. So, in your opinion, was it those developments that led to the unraveling of the book's title? When did it begin, or do you see the actual unraveling you're writing about as being a feature just of the last 9 years of Trump's dominance of American political scene?
So my view of these sorts of extraordinary stresses on the body of politics is that they're not just the handiwork of an individual. So, for example, I don't share the view, and I say that in the book, that as destructive in many ways as his politics was, I don't believe that Newt Gingrich single-handedly dragged the Congress into an era of polarized political gridlock. There was something taking place in the political culture that he tapped into, something he was drawing on to become the leader of the moment in the Republican Party. And I think the same thing's true of Donald Trump. I think that Trump, obviously, there are all sorts of aspects of Trump that are unique to him as a political figure, but what he's driving at What he's attempting to do with this form of demagogic populism is something, by the way, we also see in other Western democracies currently. We see these same kinds of issues playing off of economic dislocation, social dislocation, immigration. The way he weaves all of that into this playing on those issues and addressing legitimate concerns in the electorate is something he couldn't do unless there were those issues to be raised and that sort of response to be garnered. And so I think there's a complex set of issues having to do with structural changes in the economy, demographic change, and the like, which is complex. And I can't pretend to have any more sophisticated grasp on this than anybody else does, but books are pouring off the presses on this topic. But it has put enormous stress on our politics. And the issue for me, just to be very clear about ethics, is that at the end of the day, if people in public responsibilities, those who hold political responsibility, those who hold official responsibility, are prepared to throw everything to the side in the name of winning an election or prevailing on a policy dispute, and do not have in mind what it means for us to show no solicitude, no concern at all for democratic institutions, for democratic processes, or for democratic norms, the erosion of those norms, processes, and institutions are going to proceed apace. And one day we'll look back and we'll find out they've been damaged beyond repair. And so it's a call for people, and we can talk about some very specific examples, who do care about those kinds of issues, who in the middle of all of this polarization can call our attention to the need to preserve them.
Okay, and we will get to those, but let's delve a little bit more into something you do have claim to greater authority, which is political lawyering itself. I want to start with you personally, Bob, because, some law students dream of careers in civil rights or criminal defense or whatever. You actually describe political lawyering as your version of a calling. That's really, what you dreamed of as a young lawyer. What captivated you in particular about the role and, reflecting on your career? How has the path matched your initial aspirations for it?
I was fortunate because I was politically very active before I went off to law school. And I went off to law school at a time when the country was about to embark for the very first time, really in American history, on an extensive experiment in the regulation of the political process, in controlling campaign finance, in revising the standards of government ethics and putting in enforcement mechanisms, in changing, for example, or the evolving theories of liability for public official corruption. So suddenly politics became more of a regulated industry. And for that reason, it became more of an opportunity for lawyers to practice in it. And so I graduated from law school the year the Supreme Court in Buckley versus Vallejo upheld, for the most part, with exceptions, the constitutionality of the campaign finance reforms of the 1970s. They're often described as the Watergate reforms, but they were in progress before then. And so when I left law school, as soon as I could, I started looking for opportunities to build a practice in that area. I couldn't do so immediately because it wasn't economically self-sustaining, but over time, as the regulatory process expanded, there was work for lawyers and work that you could count on being compensated for, which gave you an opportunity to park that practice in a larger law firm. And that's what I did. Now, I will also say what was interesting about this is, therefore, I was always in the middle of politics, representing campaigns or donors or candidates or organizations that were active in politics, committees, trade associations, you name it. It also meant that I had an opportunity to work with politicians and to be integrally involved in matters they were concerned with, like succeeding with a policy or succeeding in an election. And as a result of that, I had an opportunity to meet people who gave me a real opportunity in my career. For example, Senator Obama, who upon becoming president, offered me at some point the opportunity to become White House counsel, which is the best job I ever had. So there were two parts to it. And that was, the latter part was a function of the first.
Got it. I mean, I guess in some ways it worked out even better than you could have reasonably hoped.
Yes.
You really did inhabit the Olympus of political lawyering. And just one more quick question on the role, because, you talk about the warrior mentality of politics, and that does, in fact, spill over into the role of lawyers. You think of the normal successful litigator or a transaction lawyer as being the wise, steady hand, telling the client, no, you can't do this, temper, etc. But your portrayal of the best political lawyers are, they're pretty much in the fray themselves, including the profane thoughts about the other side, etc. You're really, in a way, more on the actual political team. Is that fair relative to?
No, that's exactly fair, but it's also the risk because on the one hand, you're wearing the team jersey and you care profoundly about winning. On the other hand, you are a lawyer. And that doesn't just mean, by the way, counseling accurately on legal requirements or restrictions. It also means that's what the best, most seasoned lawyers do, stepping back and giving the client a perspective on the pathways that are available, but also choices that office holder has. You could theoretically do X, but, and now just speaking as your advisor,
Yeah.
there are reasons why you might not want to do it. And in order for you to give that kind of advice, you have to be relatively sensitive to, you have to be experienced like any lawyer practicing within a particular industry, if you will. It's funny to call politics an industry, but when billions of dollars are spent on politics, it's hard not to think of it as an industry. You have to also be mindful of other costs that could enter into pursuing a legally aggressive or risky path. And so you have to be willing to say, okay, that's my legal advice. And then let me just talk a little bit, because I know who you are and what you're about, on which of those pathways may make the most sense, all things considered. Are you sacrificing something in your brand? Are you going to be doing something that is going to spark retaliatory action? You're going to wind up in a sort of cycle of political violence that will take your campaign away from its main themes, or whatever that kind of advice may be. It's the lawyer as counselor and not just the lawyer essentially as law-informed nerd.
Right. And your book makes clear, it's one of the many reasons to read it, everyone, but we probably won't get into this too deep, but makes it clear that counselor's role really varies in nuanced and interesting ways, depending, Bob, you've had all of the experiences of advising a political candidate, political official like the president, and in a way, the sort of embodiment of the presidency and keeping your eye out for that official position. I think the nuances in very interesting ways vary. All right. You mentioned campaign finance reform, and you've got a really interesting take on it in the book. So I wanted to move to that. And it's sort of part of, I'd like to package it, I guess, with lying, which you suggest is largely beyond the reach of the legal system to regulate. So you write in the book, it is pointless in any discussion of campaign ethics to argue that politicians should not lie or that you can prevent them. Real pointless. Why?
I don't think all lies are the same.
Right. Well, that's where we're going. Yeah.
Right. Politicians puff up their records. Politicians say things about their opponent records that are not necessarily the most charitable construction of the facts. Politicians every day say things they don't mean, like, hey, Bob, it's great to see you. That was a great meeting, and I learned a lot, when they couldn't wait to run out the door and they would hope never to see you again. There's a performative aspect to politics. And so a little bit of deception and frankly, puffery in the presentation of their records or their programs, the things that they promise they will do. Politicians offer up to the public visions of what their office holding will mean that are at best aspirational and at worst unachievable. And yet at the same time, they're making promises they think at least help define for the voters what the choices in the election are. But then I talk in the book about the really bad stuff that politicians and the people who advise them, lawyers, speechwriters, the people who cut the ads, ought not to be involved in. And that is the deliberate, outright lying to voters or manipulation of voters on fundamental issues, where they just, in effect, decide to say that red is blue and black is white. And they do so in a very studied attempt to deceive people on material issues in significant ways. And I give an example from a 2000 presidential election campaign in which the campaign I represented was the subject of a just outrageous misrepresentation of fact that was very damaging. Not the only reason, I'm quick to admit, that my candidate lost, but it was widely recognized to have been a deliberate lie, and even after uncovered, constantly repeated, because ultimately it's very hard, as we all know, for anyone to catch up with the original lie. And I think there are real questions there about, isn't there an outer bound, an ethical outer bound? I think there is. By the way, you can take it into government. The view that people fundamentally took of the Johnson administration lying about the war, lying about the progress of the war, right? And if it starts in a campaign, where does it end? If it starts when a candidate is a politician and the candidate is successful, why would we expect the behavior to be any different when the candidate achieves high office? And the ethics of that, and I consider these a small d democratic ethical issues, are ones that ought to matter to the advisors as well.
You've raised so much, but let me follow up on where you ended. You do consider it a matter of small d democratic ethics. Even, I was going to ask you, because it is, as you underscore your position, that there are certain lies that really are beyond the bounds, and not all lies are equal. And I think you've given a kind of effort at defining those just now with materiality and brazenness of the lie, etc. But the follow-up is, you consider it a matter of democratic ethics. Why don't you, this goes back to my questions about campaign finance, we've all seen the prescription drug commercials and those really funny, from seconds 35 to 55, this could, blah, 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 and you have disclaimers. It's a requirement of law. I believe you do consider it beyond the capacity of the legal system to regulate in a legal way as opposed to an ethical way. We'll get back to that distinction. Even these brazen lies. Is that right? And why? Why can't you just have a regime that punishes, calls out brazen material lies?
Well, the problem that you always face is that not everybody agrees on what a lie is. And at some point, if there's a regulatory process, if we imagine there's some way to do this, and by the way, some states have had anti-fraudulent campaign misrepresentation codes.
Oh, I didn't know that. Is that right?
Yes, some states have had those. They're not constitutional.
Oh, that.
They're constitutional in the sense you can't impose real penalties on candidates for saying something that somebody else thinks is a lie about, say, what you have said about your opponent's position on Social Security. You think you've supported it. Your opponent has found some procedural vote in Congress, and they think that's a vote against it. So they say it's not true. You're against Social Security. And if you become the candidate, or if you become the office holder, you'll do whatever you can to unwind Social Security. These fights are fights that will always take place. By the way, they take place in some context. I write about in the book how for many years, and I think it continues to happen in congressional campaigns, if third-party groups go on the air with a fallacious ad, candidates will go to stations and pressure them not to run them, because stations don't have to run third-party editorial ads, and they could take them down for any reason whatsoever. And I, by the way, once successfully advised a candidate on doing that, and the candidate was sued for tortious interference with contract by the third-party group, and I was called as a witness in a federal trial because I'd written a legal memo on which that claim was based. By the way, the claim was dismissed.
And was it because your characterization as a lie was accurate?
It's been a while now, but the problem was that the law that was being cited to the station, you can take this ad down if you don't want to run it. If you think it's false, if you don't think it's in the public interest, you can. That was the correct law. Now, that is not the same, by the way, as you know, with federal candidates. Their stations are immunized from libel because they have to both take the advertising in reasonable amounts and they can't censor it. Of course, a candidate can also sue another candidate for libel. I talk about that in the book, but that's a very perilous path to pursue, and it rarely happens. So the long and short of it is, it's hard to imagine a constitutional regulatory structure that distinguishes what is an acceptable political lie from what is an illegal political lie. And therefore, so much of that policing has to take place at the basic level of good conscience, of just sort of when it is that you owe the voters more. Because you're not just lying about the other candidate, you're lying to the voters. You're selling them a bill of goods. And we want to give the voters, within all of the understandable boundaries of hard-fought politics, we want to give the voters the information that as voters they're entitled to have on which to make informed decisions in voting for one candidate rather than another. So one thing a lawyer wants to do is, for example, in reviewing campaign ads, look at something and say, well, gee, I suppose we could say that. We could get away with saying it, but should we say it?
Yeah, and that is actually an important distinction that you raise later in the book, that, we think of lies, even brazen lies, as being from candidate to candidate, but then you to quote you, in a period of angry politicized politics, the weapons may be turned in fresh, expanded directions that really do pull the wool over the eyes of voters. Much more to explore there, but not enough time for it, Bob. Let's turn to money. You have an idiosyncratic view of its impact on politics and of the efficacy and desirability of campaign finance regulation. Can you explain your basic position here?
Yes, I'm not opposed to sort of basic, for example, transparency requirements and some fundamental reasonable limits on campaign contributions to candidates. But the history of campaign finance regulation in the United States is a history of promises simply not kept, expectations generated that were never satisfied. We cannot take the money out of politics. And in truth, those who are particularly fighting over political office in a polarized period of time, where, as we discussed earlier, the stakes are considered to be existential, don't want to be limited in how much they spend. When I try to talk to a Democratic audience about campaign finance, I ask the following question to Democrats: what limit would you put on the amount of money that you can spend to end the political career of Donald Trump? And no one has ever given me a number. Is it 2 billion, 3 billion, 5 billion, 9 billion, 10 billion?
We're kind of finding out now with there's events where you can get a picture with Kamala Harris for 50, right? Exactly.
Yeah. So, I mean, the answer is there is no limit on what they would spend for that purpose. And the other point I would make very simply is we have to look at the experience of it, which is regulation upon regulation. Typically, it starts with a rule. The rule is circumvented. Another rule is passed to prevent the circumvention. And this cycle repeats itself until the law is so complicated, it still doesn't do what it is supposed to do, but it requires lawyers to engage in politics. And you spend a lot of money hiring people to help you navigate that system.
And what's wrong with that? No, I'm just kidding.
Well, it worked for me very well for many years.
Exactly. Okay, but I think there's a bigger point that you make, Bob, which is, quote you, nothing over the many decades I've been involved in politics has suggested to me that money has nearly the corruptive effect that reformers claim. You see it as less toxic in the system. People give big contributions and, you have to invite them to the parties and maybe they have access. But you really think that it's an inaccurate, though widely held supposition that people give big contributions and expect or receive actual corrupt, you would say in that sense, political favoring. And is that correct?
That is correct. I mean, there is no question there are times when we see behaviors by those who have money who try to corruptly sway the legislative process. That's happened, and it's, and there have been prosecutions along those lines. But a huge amount of money that goes into politics is ideologically or partisan in focus. And I'll give you an example from recent history. And by the way, there's studies of this. Think about the people that we refer to now as major donors. I mean, really wealthy people who give a lot to the party and also give unlimited amounts to super PACs. Those individuals, the ones who are most prominent, are in it because they have really strong convictions about the direction that their party, their candidates should go. And think about the role of major donors, for example, who pressured the party and, for that matter, pressured former President Biden to withdraw from the race, identified themselves in public and said, I'm not giving another penny unless the president withdraws. That's influence, but it's not influence based on economic self-interest. It's influence based on the role that they think they play in party affairs. They put a lot of money in it, and they want their money to accurately represent their political positions. I think that's more of the wealthy money that we see than money that is actually directed, necessary to them in buying their preferred public policy. And I'll just add to that very quickly. The most unregulated and effective policy influencing money is lobbying money. Rather than spend money to support the election of one candidate or the other, the money can be spent by interested parties just to manage the legislative process. And that's not regulated. I mean, it's regulated. There are disclosure requirements that apply to lobbying funding. And there are also some criminal penalties, as you're well aware, that attach to certain uses of lobbying money. But the total amount of money that you and I could spend to either stop a bill we didn't want or to pass a bill that we wanted, there's no limit. And that's where a lot of savvy investors, if you will, go.
Right. Well, let me follow up on this notion of savvy investors because I agree with you. You certainly see people who give a lot of money, and there's some combination of vanity or maybe advantage in their own sort of the rest of their life, but they know that you can't try to whisper in the air of the candidate you've given millions to how to vote. But what about organizations who don't have vanity? So the NRA is thought to give tons of money and get policy preferences in return. Your view would suggest that they're kind of irrational or diluted, even though we think of capitalism as driven by rational actors. Advertising to me always seems like, can it really be worth millions? But I guess so, to have that Super Bowl ad. So do you think the same kind of benignness or absence of really sort of viciousness applies even for the organizations that pony up millions and millions and millions to certain candidates?
Without a doubt. I mean, those organizations and others like them on both the left and the right see merit in having certain individuals win office rather than others. That's certainly true. And by the way, many of them raise an enormous amount of money in small donations. They actually generate a lot of wealth out of small givers,
including President Trump.
Yeah. Correct. So that would apply to a whole host of organizations on the left and the right. My only point being that if you were, say, a publicly traded corporation, you had an enormous amount of money available to you to try to swing public policy in one direction or another, you don't need to play in the electoral process. You can do enough of that just to basically stop people from asking you for the money, but you can turn your attention to lobbying. You can just wait until the election's over and then push hard, utilizing unlimited resources to manage the legislative process toward your goals. So I think on all of these points, what people are prepared to live with in the way of limits on their political activity, the actual motivation of our largest individual donors, the wealthy people in this country who play in politics, the alternative of lobbying to large companies that don't want to get to the middle of the mess that is electoral politics. For all those reasons, I think that our expectation of a campaign finance regime and what it can accomplish ought to be relatively modest.
Fair enough. And of course, when you're doing that other route, you are legitimately having the services of the very good friends, the former members there who really just have the natural entree of social connections. All right. I want to turn to your basic prescription and your call for greater ethics. I just have one little personal parochial question, being a part of the problem as you describe it, which is you specifically cite as part of the diminution of ethical boundaries the role of the legal commentator on TV. And so as contributing to these sort of oversimplification and polarizing. So let me have it. I've got a lot of company, but give me your thoughts about why this little institution that's such a strange one that, lawyers all of a sudden people want to, hear on cable TV, but why you think that's like part of the problem here.
Well, so by the way, I did not name check you as a bad guy in the book, just to be clear.
Jeez, I hope so. I don't think we'd have done a talking books with my index, Littman, asshole, page 45.
Did not do that. No, did not do. Didn't do it.
All right. Yeah. And I should say, we should have said up front, I used to work for you in a political campaign. In 2004, you were the general counsel, and I was one of your state counsels. So
absolutely, certainly. By the way, the rise of the legal commentator is a function about how legalized combat in politics has become. Right? People need to understand. Think of the impeachment processes. Think of major criminal prosecutions of either public corruption or high-level officials, special counsel investigation, that sort of thing. So there's a need for lawyers to be able to explain the process to the general public, and that's a perfectly legitimate exercise. What I think has happened, of course, and it's in your response, I know I'm not the one who's supposed to be asking the question.
No, go for it.
Is that community has become polarized too. And as a result of that, there are certain views that are sort of pronounced and favored in that space on either side, and not so much pronounced and favored. And I give the example of everyone who was the larger public seeking what they thought was the right outcome in the Mueller investigation, namely that Donald Trump would be charged, right? Were just shocked to the core when Bob Mueller concluded otherwise. And part of the reason was that they'd heard a lot of lawyers saying, oh, this is slam dunk. I mean, he's going to be responsible for this, responsible for that. This has got to be the result, or that has to be the result. Now, by the way, I say all of this again. I've done this kind of commentary and I've written op-eds. And, it's not like I don't do so in an environment in which I take very particular points of view and they're conditioned by the convictions that I have. And I'm not going to single myself out as being a particular virtuous commentator looming over all the others. But I do think that we have seen comments and op-eds published that are more designed to meet the expectation of the audience and, in my judgment, reflect the considered legal positions of those who make those comments.
Yeah. So look, I think it's 100%. Well, I would kind of, I also do op-eds, and there I do my best, and I have enough time to develop 1,000 words or whatever. I think what you diagnose is really true on TV. Actually, it's the reason why the Talking Feds podcast started many moons ago, as we were on TV, we former prosecutors, and pontificating as if we A, knew, and B, this were actually the way decisions were made in the federal government. And they weren't. They were much less certain, much more amorphous. And that's why the whole notion for what Talking Fed started as, which was a prosecutor's show. But I think the siloing of political opinion absolutely is true of commentators. This is actually the reason I'm a weirdo here, but I'm not contracted to any particular station. I do others, even though that means I don't make money from TV stuff. But I just do think it's true that maybe this is the way they're selected. But commentators basically, wear on their forehead what their views are, and you go to them, good old Bob or Jane or Bill, because they're going to say the predictable thing. And that's not that different from having the political person on there who's going to say the predictable thing. So let me just say, I agree with you. Okay. Your main prescription, to the extent you have one, Bob, very much focuses on, it's part of the title, on ethics. We need political ethics, a rules-based approach. And the first thing that strikes me when I hear that is something other than law, something other than the sorts of requirements that when you don't follow them, sanctions ensue, but rather a more, to use a quaint, maybe improper, effete word, a kind more of a sort of gentlemanly understanding. So I wanted to ask you to expound on that, but also just raise the point, if we're in a degenerated situation or landscape in our politics where people don't follow laws, why the hell would we think, why isn't it sort of, starry-eyed of you to say, oh, let's improve our ethics?
Because there's some activities that the law doesn't reach. And then let me give you an example, since we were talking about campaign finance, partly as a result of Supreme Court opinions that you're well familiar with, like the case involving Governor McDonnell in Virginia, for other reasons that we can go into. There are, including, by the way, I should mention campaign finance decisions authored by Chief Justice Roberts. There's a zone of protected activity between an office holder and people who have money that the law does not reach. So, for example, if an office holder has voted a certain way, maybe completely consistent with promises that the office holder made to the electorate or to a particular community of interested parties, has voted a certain way, there's nothing to prevent that office holder from then returning to those who are happy with the policy and saying, boy, I was good to you, now you need to be good to me. I'd like to have campaign contributions. I'm oversimplifying, but that's roughly the idea. When they didn't promise it in advance of the vote, they may have made a commitment to vote that way well before, but now they're capitalizing on the happiness of that community with the outcome to try to raise money.
By the way, you've sort of just described the fact pattern of the New York mayor and why it might be a hard case for the SDNY, right?
Correct. I'm not deeply familiar with all the facts. I'm familiar with the reporting.
Basically, they gave him favors and then said, okay, pal, now it's time. Seems corrupt, but there's not the moment of quid pro quo that the law and the Supreme Court insist on.
Exactly. It got complicated with the bribery statutes, under the legal gratuity statutes, but there is an ethical issue there. And in 1952, The former reforming senator from Illinois, Paul Douglas, wrote a very good book called Government and Ethics.
Oh, I thought you were going to say Adlai Stevenson. Sorry.
Well, Stevenson, another one from Illinois.
Who I thought of, he ran and then ran again. And then, yeah, I'm sorry, but go ahead.
And Douglas was a reformer, but he wrote I think he delivered some lectures at Harvard University, and then were published in a book called Ethics in Government. And one of the points that he makes is office holders have to be sensitive to those circumstances. They have to allow for what he called a decent interval between the time they cast a particular vote and the time that they look for people to support them financially because of that vote. And let me give you another example where the office holder has a conversation with somebody who says, I really, really want you to support, ethanol manufacturer. And in that same conversation, campaign fundraising comes up. And even though there's no quid pro quo that's explicitly stated, the two joined together in that way might lead somebody to believe that it's a corrupt bargain. Who manages that? The law reaches only so many of those cases. The rest of it's left to the ethical judgment of the office holder. And in the House and the Senate, actually, there are ethics codes that look to fill in the gaps where the law doesn't reach and give members of Congress guidance on how to respond in certain circumstances. And as you know, that was the basis for, and this goes back a long, long way, I'm aging myself, but the famous Keating 5 case, in which the Senate censured and ended the political career of one of the Keating 5, Senator Alan Cranston of California, because they said he had established what they called an improper linkage between official actions and campaign fundraising. But that improper linkage wasn't an illegal linkage. He was never prosecuted. It was an unethical linkage, or at least so the Senate Ethics Committee concluded. That's why I say there are policies that people in government or standards that they can adopt, and they should be held accountable for either not having them or not following them.
All right. So there's a day a few years ahead where things are better. What has concretely happened between now and then? Who has stepped up and done what on an ethical dimension that has actually brought us halfway out of the muck?
Well, this is a project that's going to require sort of time and patience, and it's one that has been pursued for a long, long time. That is to say, to kind of restore a certain degree of ethical vibrancy to the political process. But let me give you an example which gives me some hope from contemporary politics, and that is the defense of our electoral process. And I have worked with Republicans, and I'm continuing to work with Republicans, I discussed it in the book, outside my partisan pursuits, on bringing community leaders of any political conviction together with election officials to defend the electoral process against the kind of threats on that process, threats on these officials, sowing of loss of public confidence in the process. And the idea is to have those in the community who are trusted voices. They're not politicians. They own businesses. They head trade associations. They are the ministers in whatever religious congregations are prominent in the community. They head community colleges. They're trusted voices in that sense. They're in the community who speak out after extensive dialogue with election officials and an opportunity to sort of, if you will, kick the tires in the way that they're preparing the election. They speak out on behalf of the electoral process. They refute the lies that are being told about the porousness or the fraudulence of the electoral process. And what could be more core to our democratic pursuits than having some trust in our electoral process that is not, in fact, rigged to just, for example, only elect Democrats? And so I know you're familiar with him, Ben Ginsburg and I, and Ben is a longtime Republican, was general counsel of the Romney presidential campaign. We co-chair an organization called Pillars of the Community. We travel around the country and we try to recruit these community leaders to sit with election officials and then ultimately stand up for them and for the process. That is a profoundly civic spirited and in the end, ethical undertaking. You may want Donald Trump to win. You may like his policies on regulation or taxes. You might want Kamala Harris to win because you prefer the alternatives that she offers. But at the end of the day, what's most important is that we preserve the fundamental confidence in the mechanisms and justified confidence in the mechanisms by which we elect our public officials. And I've been encouraged, when you go behind closed doors, you can be looking a Trump voter in the eye, and I'm not saying it's true of all of them, and there's a hardcore that aren't listening, but they are willing to engage in a dialogue about what's necessary to preserve that core democratic institution. And that's critical. That to me is an example of something that everybody ought to be able to sign on to.
The book is The Unraveling by Bob Bauer, who is a professor of practice and distinguished scholar in residence at NYU Law School. Bob, thanks so much for spending time talking to us about it. Encourage everyone to read. There's a lot we haven't been able to cover, but I'm really happy with what we were able to cover. Thanks again for your time.
Thank you, Harry. Very much appreciate it.
Thank you for tuning in to One on One, a weekly conversation series from Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts, and please take a moment to rate and review this podcast. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we post full episodes, talking books, and bonus video content. Talking Feds remains one of the very few independent productions out there. So if you like the work we do and are inclined to support the show, joining our Patreon is the best way to do it. Plus, you'll get tons of perks like free access to my LA Times op-eds and the chance to join monthly live Q&A sessions. Thanks for tuning in, and don't worry, as long as you need answers, the feds will keep talking. Talking Feds One-on-One is produced by Catherine Devine, associate producer Gabriella Glick, sound engineering by Matt McArdle, Rosie Dawn Griffin, Hamza Mehendranathan, David Lieberman, and Emma Maynard are our contributing writers. Production assistance by Akshaj Turbailu and Genesis Magpayo. Our music, as ever, is by the amazing Philip Glass. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.